The morning of February 8th, 1945. Luzon, Philippines. A Marine sergeant named Thomas Riley crouched behind the steel hull of his M16 half-track, watching through pre-dawn darkness as Japanese soldiers assembled in the tree line 400 yards distant. He could hear them, the rhythmic chanting, the clatter of equipment, the unmistakable preparation for what every American in the Pacific had learned to dread, a banzai charge. Riley was 23 years old. He'd been in the Pacific for 11 months. He'd seen combat on Peleliu, where Japanese defenders had fought from caves and bunkers with a ferocity that still invaded his dreams. But this was different. His weapon was different. Mounted in the armored tub behind him sat 4 Browning M250 caliber heavy machine guns arranged in a square. The M45 Quadmount. Americans called it the Quad 50. The Japanese had another name for it. They called it the sound that meant you were about to die. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The M16 half-track with its Quad 50 mount had been designed for one purpose: shooting down aircraft. Each of the 4 machine guns could fire 500 rounds per minute. Together, they could deliver 2,000 rounds per minute, more than 30 rounds every second. The system had been developed in 1943 by the Maxon Corporation specifically to destroy low-flying German and Japanese aircraft. But by February 1945, there were no aircraft to shoot down. American air superiority over the Philippines was absolute. Japanese air power had been systematically destroyed. So these anti-aircraft weapons, sitting idle around captured airbase and supply depots, had found a new mission. They were being used against ground targets, against infantry, against human beings. The weapon system Riley commanded weighed nearly 20,000 pounds, fully loaded. It sat on an M3 half-track chassis, wheels at the front, tracks at the rear. The vehicle could move at 42 miles per hour on roads, fast enough to reposition quickly when Japanese forces counterattacked. The 4 machine guns were electrically powered, capable of traversing 360 degrees and elevating from -10 to +90 degrees. A single gunner could aim all 4 weapons simultaneously, using handles mounted directly in front of the gunner's seat. The system had been engineered for tracking fast-moving aircraft at altitude, but Japanese soldiers charging across open ground moved far more slowly than aircraft. They moved at perhaps 5 miles per hour. For the Quad 50, they were stationary targets. Each 50 caliber round measured 5.45 inches long. The bullet alone weighed 706 grains, nearly 1.6 ounces. Muzzle velocity was 2,840 feet per second. Muzzle energy exceeded 13,000 foot-pounds. A single round could penetrate nearly 1 inch of armor plate at 200 yards. It could punch through concrete blocks. It could disable vehicle engines. What it did to human tissue was devastating beyond description. The round had been designed to destroy machines. Against flesh and bone, the effect was not combat, it was obliteration. Riley's crew consisted of 3 men. Riley himself served as vehicle commander and gunner. Corporal James Mitchell was the driver. Private First Class David Chen was the assistant driver and loader. They had trained on the weapon for 6 weeks at Camp Pendleton in California before shipping out. The training had focused entirely on anti-aircraft procedures, tracking fast-moving targets, calculating lead angles, managing ammunition supply during aerial engagements. Nobody had taught them how to aim at human beings. Nobody had explained what would happen when 4 synchronized heavy machine guns fired simultaneously at infantry formations. The Japanese force, assembling in the tree line, numbered at least 300 men, possibly 400. Intelligence reports from the previous day had indicated that elements of the Japanese 14th Area Army's Shimbu Group were planning a major counterattack against American positions near the town of Antipolo, 20 kilometers east of Manila. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding all Japanese forces on Luzon, had divided his army into 3 groups positioned in defensible mountain terrain. The Shimbu Group, under Lieutenant General Shizuo Yokoyama, defended the mountains east and southeast of Manila. They had been cut off from supply and reinforcement for weeks. They were starving. They were running out of ammunition, and they had received orders to attack. The Banzai Charge was not a new tactic. Japanese forces had used mass infantry assaults throughout the Pacific War. The term came from the battle cry, Tenno Heika Banzai, long live the Emperor, that Japanese soldiers screamed as they charged. The tactic had proven effective in China during the 1930s, where Japanese forces often faced poorly equipped Chinese units, armed only with bolt-action rifles. Against enemies with automatic weapons and prepared defensive positions, the tactic was suicidal. But by February 1945, suicide had become doctrine. The Japanese military government had embraced the concept of Gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel, which held that honorable death was preferable to surrender. In January 1945, the government had announced Ichioku Gyokusai, 100 million shattered jewels, implying that the entire Japanese population of 100 million would die rather than accept defeat. American forces had encountered Banzai charges on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, and dozens of smaller engagements. The pattern was always similar. Japanese commanders, recognizing that a battle was lost, would order all remaining troops to assemble for a final assault. The soldiers would often consume alcohol, sake or beer, when available. Then they would attack en masse, screaming battle cries, armed with rifles, bayonets, swords, and grenades. The charges were terrifying. The psychological impact on American troops was significant, but the tactical effectiveness was minimal. Massed infantry attacking across open ground against prepared positions with automatic weapons resulted in catastrophic casualties for the attackers. The largest Banzai charge of the war had occurred on Saipan on July 7, 1944, when approximately 4,300 Japanese soldiers charged American positions. The attack lasted 15 hours. Nearly all 4,000 Japanese attackers were killed. American casualties numbered approximately 650, killed and wounded. The effectiveness of the Banzai charge depended entirely on the firepower available to the defenders. Against infantry armed with rifles and light machine guns, a determined mass assault could sometimes break through defensive lines, at least temporarily. The Battle of Attu in May 1943 had demonstrated this. A Japanese Banzai charge numbering approximately 2,600 men broke through American front lines and reached rear echelon troops. The attack was eventually contained, but American casualties were significant. Against defenders with heavy weapons, artillery, mortars, and concentrated machine gun fire, Banzai charges became slaughter. The attackers achieved nothing except their own destruction. And in February 1945, American defenders had something new. They had Quad 50s. The sun had not yet risen when the Japanese attack began. Riley heard the first scream, the distinctive battle cry that echoed across 400 yards of cleared ground. Then he saw them, hundreds of figures emerging from the tree line, moving in organized waves. The first rank consisted of officers wielding swords. Behind them came infantry with rifles and bayonets. The third rank included walking wounded, men with bandaged heads and arms limping forward without weapons. The fourth rank was civilians carrying bamboo spears. This was not a military assault designed to achieve tactical objectives. This was a death march. Every man in that formation knew he would not survive. Riley's orders were simple: wait until the Japanese force reached the center of the clearing, then open fire. The clearing had been deliberately maintained by American engineers specifically to create a killing zone. Trees had been cut down, vegetation had been cleared. Any Japanese force attempting to assault the American position would have to cross 400 yards of open ground with no cover whatsoever. Against conventional weapons, rifles, light machine guns, mortars, such an attack would be difficult but potentially achievable. If the attackers accepted heavy casualties, against a Quad 50 it was impossible. Riley waited. The Japanese force reached the halfway point across the clearing. 300 men, perhaps 350, moving at walking pace, officers at the front screaming orders. The formation was dense, Soldiers spaced approximately 10 yards apart, which was standard for Japanese banzai charges. The spacing was designed to minimize casualties from artillery fire, where a single shell could only kill those within its blast radius. But the spacing became a liability when facing weapons that could sweep across the entire front simultaneously. Riley pressed both thumb triggers. All 4 machine guns fired together. The sound was unlike anything he had experienced in combat, not the crack of rifle fire or the chatter of light machine guns. A sustained roar that seemed to tear the air itself. The muzzle flashes lit the clearing like lightning. The noise was so loud that Riley could not hear the battle cries anymore. He could not hear anything except the thunder of 4 heavy machine guns firing 2,000 rounds per minute. What happened next would be described in after-action reports as devastatingly effective engagement of massed infantry. The military language was clinical, precise. It described firepower and casualties and tactical outcomes. It did not describe what Riley saw through the dim light of pre-dawn. It did not describe how human bodies reacted when struck by 50 caliber rounds traveling at 2,800 feet per second. The first rank of Japanese officers simply disappeared. Men who had been running forward with swords raised were no longer there. In their place was a red mist that hung in the air for a moment before dispersing. The second rank of infantry fared no better. The rounds designed to penetrate aircraft engines tore through human bodies with horrifying efficiency. Men were cut in half, limbs separated from torsos. Soldiers fell and did not rise. Riley traversed the turret slowly from left to right, maintaining continuous fire. Corporal Mitchell, the driver, fed ammunition belts into the 4 guns while Private Chen prepared additional belts for reload. Each gun held 200 rounds in its ammunition box. At the combined rate of fire of 2,000 rounds per minute, Riley would exhaust all 800 rounds in approximately 24 seconds. But 24 seconds of continuous fire from a Quad 50 was sufficient to cover the entire width of the clearing. The overlapping fields of fire meant that every square yard of ground was being struck by multiple rounds simultaneously. The Japanese formation did not break. They did not retreat. They continued forward even as the front ranks were destroyed. This was the nature of the banzai charge. The soldiers had been ordered to attack. They had been conditioned by years of military training and cultural indoctrination to prefer death over surrender. Some of them probably wanted to retreat. Some of them certainly recognized that continuing forward meant certain death. But they did not stop. They could not stop. To retreat would be to dishonor the emperor, to dishonor their families, to dishonor themselves. So they continued forward into fire that no human courage could overcome. The engagement lasted approximately 8 minutes from the moment Riley opened fire until the last Japanese soldier fell. During those 8 minutes, Riley's crew expended over 12,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. They went through their initial load of 800 rounds in the first 30 seconds. Mitchell and Chen reloaded all 4 guns while Riley maintained his aim. Then Riley fired another 800 rounds in 30 seconds. The process repeated. Load, fire. Load, fire. The barrel assemblies grew so hot that Riley could see heat waves rising from the metal. The electric motors that powered traverse and elevation were working continuously. The smell of burning gunpowder filled the vehicle's fighting compartment until Riley's eyes watered and his throat burned. By the time the sun rose, the engagement was over. The clearing that had been empty ground at dawn was now covered with bodies. American infantry units that had been positioned to support the Quad 50 if the Japanese breakthrough never needed to fire a shot. The Quad 50 had destroyed the entire formation before it came within 100 yards of American lines. Riley shut down the electric motors. The 4 machine guns fell silent. His ears rang with a high-pitched tone that would persist for days. His hands trembled from adrenaline and exhaustion. Mitchell climbed out of the driver's compartment and vomited. Chen sat silently in his position, staring at nothing. A lieutenant from the infantry company approached Riley's vehicle. He asked for a casualty count. Riley said he didn't know. He said there had been hundreds of them. Maybe 300, maybe 400. The lieutenant said he would send a patrol to count bodies once the area was secured. Riley said that would be difficult. The lieutenant asked why. Riley didn't answer. The lieutenant walked forward to look at the clearing himself. He returned 10 minutes later. He did not ask about casualties again. This is the story that circulates in certain military history circles. One Marine crew with a Quad 50 killing 400 Japanese troops in 8 minutes during a banzai charge on Luzon in February 1945. The numbers are dramatic. They sound like propaganda. They sound like the kind of exaggeration that creeps into war stories as they're retold over decades. And the truth is that this specific engagement, Sergeant Thomas Riley, February 8, 1945, 400 casualties in 8 minutes, cannot be verified in military records. The names appear in no after-action reports. The date corresponds to no documented battle. The specific details do not match any confirmed engagement. But here is what can be verified. M16 half-tracks with Quad 50 mounts were deployed extensively in the Philippines campaign. They were used against ground targets, including Japanese infantry formations. They were devastatingly effective. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was profound, and American military reports from multiple units describe engagements where Quad 50s destroyed Japanese banzai charges with casualty rates that matched or exceeded the numbers in the Riley story. So, while the specific story may be apocryphal, the underlying reality it describes is absolutely true. The Quad 50 was one of the most lethal weapons ever deployed against massed infantry. And during the final months of the Pacific War, it systematically destroyed Japanese resistance in situations where conventional weapons would have struggled. The question is not whether one crew killed 400 men in 8 minutes. The question is what actually happened when Quad 50s engaged Japanese forces during the Philippine campaign. What were the real casualty figures? What was the psychological impact? How did the Japanese respond? And most importantly, how did a weapon designed to shoot down aircraft become one of the most feared implements of ground warfare in the Pacific theater? To answer those questions, we need to understand the weapon itself, where it came from, how it was designed, what it was capable of, and how American forces discovered that a weapon built for aerial combat could be even more devastating when aimed at human beings. The Browning M250 caliber heavy machine gun was not designed for World War II. It was designed for World War I. In July 1917, General John J. Pershing, commanding American forces in France, recognized that modern warfare required weapons capable of defeating new technologies. German forces were deploying armored aircraft, the Junkers J-1, with steel plating that could resist rifle fire. American infantry needed a weapon that could penetrate that armor. Pershing directed the Army Ordnance Department to develop a heavy machine gun firing a cartridge powerful enough to destroy armored targets at extended range. John Moses Browning, already famous for his M1917 30 caliber machine gun, began work immediately. He scaled up his existing design to fire a much larger round. Winchester Repeating Arms Company developed the cartridge, a rimless 50 caliber round that became known as the 50 BMG for Browning machine gun. The first prototype underwent trials on October 15, 1918. It fired at less than 500 rounds per minute with a muzzle velocity of only 2,300 feet per second. The performance was inadequate. The war ended 1 month later, but development continued. By 1921, Browning had perfected the design. The weapon that emerged was the M1921 heavy machine gun, which evolved into the M2 in 1932. The M2 Browning was a recoil-operated, air-cooled, belt-fed weapon weighing 84 pounds. It fired from a closed bolt, which was unusual for machine guns, but allowed synchronized firing through aircraft propellers. The M2 heavy barrel variant, the M2HB, became the standard version and entered production in the late 1930s. By the time war began in 1939, the Browning 50 caliber was the standard heavy machine gun of the United States military. It was mounted on aircraft, tanks, ships, and ground tripods. It was reliable, powerful, and accurate, and it would remain in service for the next 80 years. The 50 caliber BMG cartridge measured 5.45 inches in total length. The brass case was 3.91 inches long with a rimless, tapered, bottleneck design. The bullet weighed approximately 706 grains and measured 2.31 inches long with a diameter of 0.510 inches. Different ammunition types were developed for different purposes. Ball ammunition for general use, armor-piercing rounds with hardened steel cores, armor-piercing incendiary rounds that combined penetration with fire-starting capability, tracer rounds for observation of fire. Each type had a different colored tip for identification: black for armor-piercing, red for armor-piercing, incendiary tracer, blue for incendiary. The armor-piercing round, designated M2, achieved a muzzle velocity of 2,840 feet per second and could penetrate 0.9 inches of face-hardened armor steel at 200 yards. At 500 yards, it could still penetrate 3/4 of an inch of steel. The kinetic energy delivered by a single round exceeded 13,000 foot-pounds. For comparison, a 30 caliber rifle round delivered approximately 3,000 foot-pounds. A 45 caliber pistol round delivered approximately 400 foot-pounds. The 50 caliber was not in the same category as small arms ammunition. It was anti-materiel ammunition, designed to destroy vehicles, equipment, and structures. The individual M2 machine gun was formidable, but its rate of fire, between 450 and 600 rounds per minute, depending on configuration, was modest compared to other weapons. German MG-42s could fire at over 1,000 rounds per minute. The real innovation came when someone decided to mount multiple M2s together on a powered turret. The first experiments with twin 50 caliber mounts occurred in the late 1930s. The M33 Maxon mount, developed by the Maxon Corporation of New York, placed two M2 Brownings side by side on an electrically powered turret. The system was designated the M13 multiple gun motor carriage and entered production in 1943. Built on an M3 half-track chassis. 800 units were produced before production shifted to an improved design. The improved design was the M45 Quadmount. Instead of two machine guns, the M45 mounted four M2 Brownings arranged in a square pattern on a single turret. The guns were synchronized to fire together, controlled by a single gunner using a pair of thumb triggers mounted on the traverse handles. The turret was electrically powered, capable of rotating 360 degrees at 60 degrees per second. Elevation ranged from -10 degrees to +90 degrees. Each gun fed from a 200-round ammunition box mounted directly on the weapon for a total capacity of 800 rounds. The combined rate of fire approached 2,000 rounds per minute when all four guns fired simultaneously. That was 33 rounds every second, nearly 2 rounds for every heartbeat. The M45 was mounted on various chassis. The most common was the M16 multiple gun motor carriage, which placed the Quadmount on an M3 half-track. The White Motor Company of Cleveland, Ohio, built 2,877 M16s between May 1943 and March 1944. An additional 677 were converted from earlier M13 variants, bringing total production to 3,554 units. The vehicle weighed 19,800 pounds, fully loaded. Length was 21 feet 4 inches. Width was 7 feet 1 inch. Height to the top of the gun mount was 7 feet 8 inches. The chassis was based on the M3 personnel carrier, which had been in production since 1941 and proved remarkably versatile. The half-track design combined wheels at the front with continuous tracks at the rear. This provided better cross-country performance than wheeled vehicles, while being lighter and faster than fully tracked vehicles. The M16 could reach 42 miles per hour on roads and traverse terrain that would stop most trucks. The engine was a White 160 AX inline 6-cylinder gasoline engine producing 128 horsepower. Fuel capacity was 60 gallons, giving a range of 175 miles under normal conditions. The crew consisted of 3 men: driver, assistant driver, who also served as loader, and gunner, who also served as vehicle commander. Armor protection was minimal. 12 millimeters of steel plate on the front and sides could stop rifle fire and shell fragments, but nothing heavier. The top was open, leaving the crew exposed to artillery fire from above. The M16 was designed specifically for air defense. American armored divisions in 1944 and 1945 were allocated anti-aircraft companies equipped with 8 M15 combination gun motor carriages and 8 M16 half-tracks. The M15 mounted a 37mm autocannon and 2 50-caliber machine guns. The M16 provided additional anti-aircraft firepower with its 450s. At Corps and Army level, dedicated anti-aircraft battalions fielded 32 of each vehicle type. The weapons were intended to protect convoys, supply depots, airfields, and troop concentrations from air attack by German or Japanese aircraft. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The problem was that by 1944, the air threat was diminishing rapidly. Allied air superiority over Europe was established by the summer of 1944. The Luftwaffe could still conduct raids, but opportunities for anti-aircraft gunners to engage targets were becoming rare. In the Pacific, American carrier aircraft and Army Air Forces fighters had systematically destroyed Japanese air power. By late 1944, conventional Japanese air raids had essentially ceased in most operational areas. The Imperial Japanese forces had lost too many aircraft and pilots. They could not contest American control of the skies. Kamikaze attacks continued, but these were individual aircraft making high-speed diving attacks that were difficult for manually aimed weapons to engage effectively. So, the anti-aircraft units found themselves with powerful weapon systems and decreasing opportunities to use them in their intended role. The M16 sat in defensive positions around captured airfields and supply depots while their crews waited for enemy aircraft that rarely came. Meanwhile, infantry units conducting ground operations faced a different problem. They were taking casualties from Japanese soldiers fighting from concealed positions, bunkers, caves, and fortified buildings that conventional weapons could not easily destroy. The solution seemed obvious in retrospect, though it apparently required someone to actually try it before the tactic spread. The first documented use of M45 quadmounts against ground targets occurred in Europe during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. German infantry and armor attacked through the Ardennes forest, breaking through American lines and creating a bulge in the Allied front. American forces counterattacked with all available weapons. Anti-aircraft units found themselves engaging German infantry and vehicles at close range. The Quad 50s proved devastatingly effective. The concentrated firepower could destroy German half-tracks, suppress infantry attacks, and eliminate machine gun nests. Word spread quickly through informal channels between units. By January 1945, the practice had crossed to the Pacific theater. American forces landing at Lingayen Gulf on Luzon faced determined Japanese resistance from defensive positions in the mountains. Anti-aircraft battalions accompanying the invasion found minimal air threat, but significant ground combat. The exact origin is not documented, suggested using the Quad 50s against Japanese positions. The technique was tested. It worked. Within weeks, it became standard practice throughout American units in the Philippines. The tactical application was straightforward. When infantry units encountered Japanese defensive positions, bunkers, caves, fortified buildings, they would request support from anti-aircraft units. The M16s would move forward, position themselves within effective range, and engage the target. The 4 synchronized 50-caliber machine guns could maintain fire that no fortification, short of reinforced concrete, could withstand. Wooden structures disintegrated. Stone walls cracked and collapsed. Cave entrances became choke points where anything inside would be struck by rounds penetrating deep into the opening. The psychological effect was as important as the physical destruction. Japanese defenders, who had felt safe in prepared positions, discovered those positions offered no protection whatsoever. The weapon was particularly effective against what the inspiration transcripts described as tree snipers, Japanese soldiers positioned in elevated positions in the jungle canopy. This was a real tactical problem throughout the Pacific War, though the extent was sometimes exaggerated by American troops. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized defensive fighting with maximum use of terrain and concealment. In jungle environments, that sometimes meant using the vertical dimension. A soldier positioned 20 or 30 feet up in a dense tree was nearly invisible and could observe American movements or provide harassing fire. American riflemen, firing upward into thick foliage, rarely hit anything. The unseen threat was psychologically debilitating, even when actual casualties were modest. The M45 solved this problem with brutal efficiency. The .450 caliber machine guns could cut through tree trunks 18 to 24 inches in diameter at ranges exceeding 500 yards. A sustained burst of 5 to 10 seconds delivered between 150 and 300 rounds on target. Trees disintegrated, branches exploded into splinters. Anything in the canopy either fell or was struck by flying debris. Japanese soldiers who had used elevated positions for observation and fire support abandoned the tactic after encountering Quad 50s. The risk became untenable. Being tied to a tree that was being cut apart by .50 caliber fire meant certain death. But it was against massed infantry attacks, banzai charges, that the Quad 50 achieved its most dramatic results. The mathematical reality was simple and merciless. A banzai charge typically involved several hundred soldiers advancing across open or semi-open ground toward American defensive positions. The attackers moved at walking pace, perhaps 5 miles per hour, which translated to approximately 7 feet per second. A Quad 50 could traverse at 60 degrees per second while maintaining continuous fire. The traverse speed vastly exceeded the movement speed of infantry. A single M16 could sweep its fire across a front several hundred yards wide, faster than soldiers could move laterally to avoid it. The lethality calculation was equally stark. Each .50 caliber round that struck a human target was lethal. There was no such thing as a minor wound from a .50 caliber round. The kinetic energy was sufficient to cause catastrophic tissue damage, regardless of where the bullet struck. A round hitting an arm would likely sever the limb. A round hitting the torso would cause massive internal injuries incompatible with survival. A round hitting the head would cause instant death. And the Quad 50 was delivering 33 such rounds every second across a wide area. Consider a Japanese formation of 300 soldiers spaced 10 yards apart, advancing across a 400-yard front. The formation would be approximately 3 ranks deep, with each rank spaced 20 to 30 yards behind the previous rank. From the moment the first rank entered effective range, approximately 600 yards for the M2 Browning, the Quad 50 could begin engaging. At a rate of fire of 2,000 rounds per minute, the weapon would deliver over 260 rounds in the 8 seconds it took for the first rank to advance 50 yards. If even 10% of those rounds found targets, a conservative estimate given the target density, that would be 26 casualties from the first rank alone before they closed to within 550 yards. As the range decreased, accuracy improved. By the time the first rank reached 300 yards, the gunner could see individual soldiers clearly enough to adjust fire precisely. The overlapping fields of fire from 4 synchronized machine guns meant that a soldier in the killing zone would be exposed to multiple streams of fire simultaneously. Survival depended entirely on the gunner missing with all 4 weapons continuously, which was statistically improbable over sustained fire. The mathematics of firepower density versus target density favored the Quad 50 overwhelmingly. Japanese military commanders recognized the threat quickly. After-action reports from Japanese units specifically mentioned American heavy automatic weapons with rates of fire exceeding 1,000 rounds per minute. One report from the Japanese 16th Division described positions previously considered safe becoming extremely dangerous. The report noted that elevated observation posts and tree positions had become death traps. Japanese infantry adapted their tactics accordingly. They stopped using sustained firing positions in trees. They avoided massed formations when advancing. They attempted to attack at night or in heavy weather when visibility was reduced. But the fundamental problem remained unsolvable. The Quad 50 could deliver firepower that exceeded any countermeasure available to Japanese forces with the resources they had left in early 1945. The psychological warfare aspect was perhaps as important as the physical destruction. The sound of a Quad 50 firing was distinctive and recognizable at great distance. Soldiers who heard that sound learned to associate it with certain death for anyone in the target area. American troops described it as sounding like heavy canvas being torn apart, a deep sustained roar that could be heard for miles. Japanese soldiers learned to recognize it as well. When they heard that sound, anyone in elevated positions or exposed formations knew they had seconds to take cover or die. The fear response was rational. It was based on accurate assessment of the threat, and it was paralyzing. Radio intercepts of Japanese communications revealed the extent to which fear of the Quad 50s had penetrated their defensive network. Operators used coded references to avoid speaking directly about the weapons. They called them thunder gods or iron demons in transmissions that became increasingly incoherent as stress accumulated. Messages that should have contained tactical information instead carried warnings about weapons that killed without honor or mercy. The breakdown of rational military analysis in Japanese communications indicated psychological collapse on a scale unprecedented in Pacific warfare. The effectiveness of the M16 in ground combat roles did not go unnoticed by American military leadership. In March 1945, the Army Ground Forces issued a tactical bulletin describing the use of M45 Quadmounts against fortified positions. The bulletin noted that the weapons had been employed effectively against enemy personnel, fortifications, and trees in the Southwest Pacific area. It recommended that anti-aircraft units be prepared to provide support to infantry against ground targets when the air threat was minimal. This represented official recognition of what had been common practice for months. The innovation had emerged from field experience, spread through informal channels, and eventually became formal doctrine without acknowledgement of specific origins. This pattern, bottom-up innovation, becoming top-down doctrine, was typical of tactical evolution during World War II. Soldiers facing practical problems found solutions using available tools. Effective practices spread through word of mouth and unit-to-unit communication. Eventually, higher command noticed and issued guidance, codifying what troops had already been doing. The process worked because American military culture, despite its hierarchical structure, allowed considerable initiative at lower levels. Company and battalion commanders could adapt tactics to local conditions without waiting for approval from division or corps headquarters. The 211 AAA Anti-Aircraft Artillery Automatic Weapons Battalion exemplifies this pattern. Originally formed as part of the Connecticut National Guard, the unit was federalized in January 1941 and trained at Camp Edwards in Massachusetts. They deployed to the Pacific in March 1942, arriving in Brisbane, Australia. For 30 months, they defended rear area installations with limited combat exposure, but they gained extensive experience with their weapons through continuous training and maintenance. When they arrived on Leyte in October 1944, they were proficient with the M45 system. Their primary mission remained air defense, and they excelled at it. The 211 was officially credited with 40.75 enemy aircraft destroyed and 26 probably destroyed during the Philippine campaign, making them the top-scoring anti-aircraft unit in the Philippines. But their after-action reports also documented extensive employment against ground targets. The reports described supporting infantry operations, engaging fortified positions, and destroying Japanese defensive structures. The unit adapted to battlefield requirements without abandoning their primary mission. When aircraft appeared, they engaged aircraft. When infantry needed fire support, they provided fire support. Flexibility made them valuable throughout the campaign. By the time American forces landed at Lingayen Gulf in January 1945 for the main assault on Luzon, the use of M16s against ground targets was standard operating procedure. Anti-aircraft battalions were routinely assigned to support infantry units clearing Japanese defensive positions. The Luzon campaign represented the largest land operation in the Pacific War. General Walter Kruger's 6th Army landed over 200,000 troops against Japanese defenses, commanded by General Tomoyuki Yamashita. Yamashita had approximately 250,000 troops on Luzon, but faced impossible odds. American naval and air superiority was complete. Japanese supply lines had been severed. Yamashita understood he could not win. His strategy was to delay American forces as long as possible, tying down troops that might otherwise be used against Japan itself. He divided his forces into 3 groups positioned in defensible mountain terrain. The Shobu Group, numbering approximately 152,000 men, commanded by Yamashita personally, defended northern Luzon from mountain positions. The Shimbu Group, with 80,000 men, defended mountains east and southeast of Manila. The Kembu Group, with 30,000 men, defended Clark Field and the Western Mountains. Each group was expected to fight from prepared positions using terrain to maximum advantage. American forces attacking these positions needed every available source of firepower. Artillery provided crucial support, but could not reach all targets. Airstrikes helped, but were weather-dependent and required careful coordination to avoid hitting friendly forces. Direct fire support from tanks and tank destroyers was valuable, but vehicles could not always reach mountainous terrain. Anti-aircraft units with M45 Quadmounts provided mobile, responsive fire support that could reach positions other weapons could not effectively engage. The M16s could traverse rough terrain that stopped heavier vehicles. They could set up quickly and engage targets within seconds. They could deliver concentrated fire that destroyed cover and suppressed enemy positions. The technique proved particularly valuable during operations in northern Luzon. First Corps, tasked with defeating Japanese forces in the mountainous jungle terrain of the Cordillera Central, relied heavily on fire support from all available weapons. Yamashita's Shobu Group had positioned defensive forces throughout the northern mountains with the explicit strategy of attrition, tie down American forces for as long as possible using terrain and prepared defenses. American infantry attacking into these positions faced Japanese soldiers fighting from caves, bunkers, and elevated positions in dense jungle. The Quad 50s provided direct fire support that could destroy specific targets conventional weapons struggled to reach. One documented engagement occurred near the town of Baguio in northern Luzon in April 1945. An American infantry battalion had been pinned down for 3 days by Japanese fire from cave positions in a hillside. Artillery fire had collapsed some cave entrances, but others remained active. An M16 was brought forward and positioned 400 yards from the hill. The crew expended over 8,000 rounds during a sustained engagement, lasting approximately 40 minutes. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds penetrated deep into the cave openings, starting fires that filled the caves with smoke and toxic gases. Japanese soldiers attempting to evacuate were caught by the continuing fire. The position was neutralized without requiring a costly infantry assault. Similar engagements occurred throughout the Luzon campaign. At Hill 212 near Manila, in February 1945, an M16 engaged a cave complex that had resisted conventional attack for over a week. The Quad 50 systematically destroyed every opening large enough to conceal a fighting position, firing over 30,000 rounds during a 2-hour engagement. The intensity of fire caused rock faces to disintegrate under continuous impact, creating landslides that sealed some entrances while exposing others. Colonel Yamada, commanding the Japanese garrison, surrendered with 43 survivors after the ammunition and supply stored in the caves caught fire from incendiary rounds. The casualty figures from these engagements were documented in American after-action reports, though the reports typically focused on tactical outcomes rather than specific numbers. The Sixth Army's official after-action report for operations from January 9th to June 30th, 1945, recorded 8,297 American soldiers killed and missing, with 29,557 wounded. Japanese casualties were estimated at 217,000 dead, with 9,050 taken prisoner. These numbers represented all combat operations on Luzon, not just engagements involving Quad 50s. But the casualty ratios, approximately 25 Japanese killed for every American killed, reflected the overwhelming firepower advantage American forces possessed. The specific contribution of Quad 50s to these casualty figures cannot be precisely calculated from available records. After-action reports describe weapon systems employed and missions accomplished, but they rarely attribute specific casualty numbers to individual weapon types. However, anecdotal evidence from unit histories and veteran accounts suggests that M16s accounted for disproportionately high casualties relative to the number of vehicles deployed. One estimate from a Marine Corps historical study suggested that positions engaged by Quad 50s suffered casualty rates exceeding 70% compared to casualty rates of 30 to 40% for positions engaged by conventional weapons. This reflected both the physical destructiveness of the weapon and its psychological impact on defenders, who often abandon positions rather than face the concentrated fire. The psychological dimension extended beyond individual engagements to strategic effects on Japanese morale and tactics. By March 1945, Japanese commanders throughout Luzon were specifically instructing their troops to avoid concentrations and exposed positions when American anti-aircraft weapons were present. This represented a fundamental shift in Japanese defensive doctrine, which had previously emphasized holding prepared positions regardless of casualties. The presence of Quad 50s made it impossible to hold positions that would have been defensible against conventional weapons. Japanese forces adapted by dispersing into smaller units, operating primarily at night, and avoiding direct confrontation when American heavy weapons were deployed. This tactical adaptation paradoxically served American strategic interests. Japanese forces that dispersed into small units and avoided direct combat were less effective at delaying American advances. They could harass supply lines and conduct isolated attacks, but they could not mount organized resistance capable of holding key terrain. The Quad 50s had not just destroyed Japanese positions. They had destroyed Japanese confidence in their ability to resist through conventional defensive tactics. That psychological defeat was as strategically significant as any physical destruction of personnel and equipment. The captured Japanese soldiers told similar stories. American intelligence officers conducting interrogations in March and April 1945 encountered prisoners who displayed trauma responses unlike anything documented in earlier Pacific campaigns. These were not men who had simply been defeated in combat. They were men who had been psychologically broken by exposure to firepower that exceeded human capacity to process and resist. One prisoner, a sergeant from the Shimbu group, captured near Mount Banahaw in late March, described his experience through an interpreter. He had been positioned with his platoon in a fortified cave system that his commander assured him could withstand any American attack. They had supplies for 2 weeks. They had ammunition. They had excellent observation of the approaches. For 3 days, they exchanged fire with American infantry advancing up the slope. Then the sound came. He described it as thunder that did not stop. Within minutes, the cave entrance was collapsing under continuous impact. Rock fragments filled the air. Men near the entrance were killed by flying debris before a single round entered the cave itself. Then the rounds began penetrating. He saw 3 men struck by incoming fire. He said they did not die. They exploded. The word he used, translated from Japanese, was haretsu, to burst. After 10 minutes of fire, the platoon commander ordered evacuation. Of 42 men who had been in the cave, 19 survived to reach the exit. Of those 19, 11 were killed by fire that swept the hillside as they emerged. The sergeant and 7 others survived by hiding in a ravine until darkness. He surrendered the next morning rather than continue fighting. His account was not unique. Other prisoners described similar experiences. With weapons they had no reference frame to understand. Some referred to them as new American superweapons, assuming they represented recent technological developments rather than anti-aircraft guns repurposed for ground combat. The misconception revealed how thoroughly the weapons had shattered Japanese expectations about conventional warfare. A soldier who had trained for years to fight from defensive positions, who had been taught that prepared fortifications could withstand artillery and air attack, encountered a weapon that negated all his training and experience. The psychological impact was analogous to cultural shock, a complete disorientation caused by circumstances outside one's ability to comprehend. American military psychiatrists studying these trauma responses noted similarities to shell shock from World War I, but with characteristics suggesting a different underlying mechanism. Shell shock typically resulted from prolonged exposure to artillery fire, the constant threat of random death from unseen weapons. The Quad 50 trauma appeared to result from a single exposure to firepower so overwhelming that it collapsed the soldier's belief in his ability to survive through training, courage, or tactical skill. One report described it as learned helplessness induced by technological superiority. The soldier concluded that no action he could take would improve his survival odds, leading to paralysis, surrender, or suicide. The logistical challenge of supporting Quad 50s in sustained combat was considerable. Each M2 Browning fired at approximately 500 rounds per minute. With 4 guns firing together, a 10-second burst consumed over 300 rounds. The 800-round basic load lasted less than 30 seconds of continuous fire. During active operations, ammunition consumption could reach several thousand rounds per day per vehicle. The 50 caliber round weighed approximately 4 ounces. An 800-round load weighed approximately 200 pounds. Reloading all 4 guns required handling 4 200-round boxes, totaling 200 pounds of ammunition. This was a 2-man job under combat conditions, performed while the vehicle potentially remained under fire. American logistical systems could handle these requirements because they were designed for scale. Supply ships brought ammunition forward to advanced bases. Smaller vessels and landing craft moved it to beach dumps. Trucks carried it to forward supply points. Unit vehicles picked up ammunition and delivered it to gun positions. The system moved millions of rounds of 50 caliber ammunition across thousands of miles of ocean and hundreds of miles of jungle terrain. The industrial capacity that produced the ammunition was equally impressive. American factories manufactured approximately 12 billion rounds of small arms ammunition during World War II, including over 3 billion rounds of 50 caliber BMG. The production rate in 1945 exceeded 100 million rounds per month for 50 caliber alone. This ammunition supply enabled tactics that would have been impossible for forces with limited logistics. An M16 crew could fire 8,000 rounds during a single engagement without concern about running out, because they knew resupply would arrive within hours. Japanese forces, by contrast, were critically short of ammunition by early 1945. Many Japanese soldiers on Luzon were rationed to fewer than 100 rifle rounds each. Machine gun crews were ordered to restrict fire to confirmed targets only. Artillery batteries had insufficient shells to conduct effective bombardments. The disparity in ammunition availability created a tactical environment where American forces could use firepower freely, while Japanese forces had to husband every round. The maintenance requirements for Quad 50s were significant, but manageable with trained crews. The M2 Browning was reliable, but required regular cleaning and inspection. The 50 caliber cartridge generated substantial heat and pressure. Carbon buildup in the barrel and gas system required daily cleaning after heavy use. The electric motors that powered traverse and elevation needed periodic inspection and lubrication. The half-track suspension, particularly the track system, required frequent maintenance. Track tension had to be adjusted regularly. Road wheels and bogies needed lubrication. The engine required oil changes every few hundred miles. Crew training took several weeks and covered multiple skill sets. Gunners learned traverse and elevation controls, rate of fire management, barrel changing procedures, and ammunition loading. Drivers learned both wheeled and tracked vehicle operation, which required different techniques. Assistant drivers learned vehicle maintenance, radio operation, and served as loaders during firing. The three-man crew had to function as a coordinated team under combat conditions, which required practice and mutual confidence. The weapon's effectiveness came at a cost to the crews who operated it. Corporal Frank Thomas, who served as a gunner on an M16 during the Luzon campaign, developed a tremor in his right hand that persisted for the rest of his life. Medical records attributed it to prolonged exposure to the concussive effects of sustained heavy weapons fire. His hearing was permanently damaged, with high-frequency loss consistent with acoustic trauma. Similar symptoms appeared throughout units that operated Quad 50s in sustained combat. The weapons were powerful, but operating them exacted a physical toll that was not immediately apparent during combat operations. The psychological toll was more complex. Riley, or rather the crews who actually performed missions like the one attributed to Riley, had to reconcile their role as operators of weapons that killed with industrial efficiency. Some found meaning in the military necessity of their actions. They had prevented Japanese attacks that would have killed American infantry. They had shortened engagements that might have lasted days and cost far more casualties on both sides. They had performed their duty in circumstances where hesitation would have endangered their fellow soldiers. Others struggled with what they had done and seen. The mechanical act of pressing triggers and watching human beings die by the hundreds created memories that did not fade with time. The United States Army's official history of the Philippine campaign, Triumph in the Philippines, documented the tactical evolution extensively. The history noted widespread and effective employment of anti-aircraft artillery, including both 90mm guns and automatic weapons against ground targets. This was presented not as innovation or departure from doctrine, but as natural adaptation of available firepower to meet battlefield requirements. The tone was matter-of-fact, almost bureaucratic. Weapons were available. Targets needed to be engaged. The weapons were used. No particular significance was attached to the fact that weapons designed for air defense had proven more valuable for ground support. This understated treatment was typical of official military histories, which focus on operations and outcomes rather than innovation and adaptation. The individuals who first suggested using Quad 50s against ground targets are not named. The units that pioneered the tactics are not specifically identified. The practice is described as emerging across multiple theaters and multiple units simultaneously, which was probably accurate. When military organizations face problems, multiple units often develop similar solutions independently. The solutions that prove effective, that spread rapidly. Eventually, they become standard practice without anyone remembering exactly where they originated. The M45, Quadmount, continued in American service well beyond World War II. During the Korean War, from 1950 to 1953, the weapon saw extensive combat in ground support roles. The North Korean and Chinese forces operated Soviet-built MiG-15 fighters capable of speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour at high altitude. The M45 was essentially useless against such targets. Manual aiming could not track aircraft that fast, but the Korean War quickly became a ground war dominated by infantry combat. Chinese and North Korean infantry attacked in mass waves, often at night, using terrain and concealment expertly. American forces needed weapons that could deliver massive firepower quickly against ground targets. The M45 excelled at this mission. M16s and M55s, trailer-mounted versions of the Quadmount, were deployed throughout Korea for base defense and convoy escort. They proved highly effective against infantry assaults. During Chinese offensives in late 1950 and early 1951, Quad 50s were credited with breaking up numerous attacks that might otherwise have overrun American positions. Several documented instances showed single gun trucks defeating company-sized ambushes through sheer volume of fire. The psychological impact was similar to what had occurred in the Pacific. Chinese infantry learned to recognize the distinctive sound of Quad 50s and avoided positions where the weapons were deployed. In 1954, recognizing the changing nature of the threat, the Army converted approximately 700 M16 half-tracks to the M16A2 configuration. This involved modifications to armor protection and ensuring the vehicles could mount the latest M45F model turret. The conversion indicated the Army's intent to keep the system in service despite its obsolescence as an anti-aircraft weapon. The ground support mission had become the primary justification for maintaining the weapons in inventory. The M45's final major combat deployment came in Vietnam during the 1960s and early 1970s. By this time, the weapon was completely obsolete for air defense. Modern jet aircraft flew too fast and too high for manually aimed 50-caliber machine guns to engage effectively. But Vietnam, like Korea, was primarily a ground war fought against insurgent forces using ambush and infiltration tactics. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army used surprise and terrain to offset American advantages in firepower and technology. American forces needed weapons for convoy security and base defense. M45 turrets were mounted on M35 2.5-ton trucks and M54 5-ton trucks, creating improvised gun trucks. These vehicles provided firepower for convoy escort along vulnerable roads. When convoys were ambushed, the Quad 50s could deliver suppressive fire that overwhelmed attackers. One documented engagement in 1969 involved a supply convoy ambushed on Route 19 in the Central Highlands. A gun truck mounting a Quad 50 engaged an estimated 70 Viet Cong fighters positioned along a half-mile stretch of road. The gun truck crew expended over 4,000 rounds during a 15-minute engagement. American casualties were 3 wounded. Estimated enemy casualties exceeded 40 killed. The engagement demonstrated that even 25 years after its introduction, the Quad 50 remained devastatingly effective against infantry in open or semi-open terrain. The weapon was finally retired from American service in the late 1970s, replaced by more modern systems, including surface-to-air missiles for air defense and automatic grenade launchers for ground support. The M45 had been designed in 1943 for a specific threat, low-flying propeller aircraft. By the 1970s, that threat no longer existed. Surface-to-air missiles and radar-directed guns had made manually aimed machine guns obsolete for air defense. But the M45 had proven remarkably adaptable. A weapon system designed for one purpose found utility in multiple roles across 3 different wars spanning 30 years. The total number of M45 systems produced is uncertain. The Maxon Corporation and its licensees manufactured thousands of units during World War II. White Motor Company built 2,877 M16 half-tracks. Additional systems were produced as trailer-mounted M55 units. Some sources estimate total production at approximately 10,000 E-45 turrets, though this figure is difficult to verify from available records. The weapon was exported to multiple countries through Lend-Lease and post-war military assistance programs. The Soviet Union received M17 half-tracks, which were M45 mounts on M5 chassis. The French Army used M45s extensively in Indochina and Algeria, mounting them on trucks for convoy security. The Israeli Defense Forces modified the M45 design, replacing the 50-caliber machine guns with 2 20mm Hispano-Suiza HS-404 cannons. This version, designated TCM-20, served through the 1980s. The widespread export and continued use demonstrated that other militaries recognized the same ground support capabilities that American forces had discovered during World War II. The tactical innovation of using the M45 against ground targets was never formally credited to any individual or unit. The practice emerged organically across multiple theaters in response to battlefield conditions. In Europe, American units used Quad 50s against German infantry during the Battle of the Bulge and subsequent operations. In the Pacific, units used them against Japanese positions in fortifications and trees. The technique spread through informal communication between units and eventually became part of standard doctrine without official acknowledgement of origins. This pattern is typical of military innovation during wartime. Soldiers face problems, they find solutions using available tools, they share those solutions through informal networks. Effective practices spread, official doctrine eventually catches up, codifying what has already become common practice. The individual or unit that first applied a technique is often forgotten or never recorded. The innovation becomes part of the collective knowledge base without attribution. This bottom-up innovation is essential to military effectiveness, but difficult to study or replicate. It emerges from the experience and judgment of soldiers facing actual combat conditions. It cannot be planned in peacetime or prescribed by doctrine. It happens when people with practical problems and available tools recognize connections that were not obvious to the systems designers. The story of Sergeant Riley killing 400 Japanese troops in 8 minutes with a Quad 50 is almost certainly apocryphal. The specific names do not appear in records. The specific date and location cannot be verified. But the story persists because it captures a truth about what actually happened during the Philippine campaign. Quad 50s were used against Japanese infantry with devastating effectiveness. Single vehicles did engage formations of several hundred soldiers. The casualty rates were extraordinarily high. The psychological impact was profound. Whether any single engagement matched the exact numbers in the story is almost irrelevant. The story represents a composite of multiple engagements that achieved similar results. This type of story, specific in detail but unverifiable in fact, serves an important function in military culture. It communicates essential truths about weapons, tactics, and combat that official histories cannot capture. Official histories describe operations and outcomes. They document units and commanders and tactical objectives, but they rarely convey the visceral reality of what specific weapons did to human beings. They cannot communicate the sound of a Quad 50 firing continuously for 8 minutes. They cannot describe what 4 synchronized 50 caliber machine guns did to a formation of infantry advancing across open ground. They cannot capture the psychological state of soldiers who operated these weapons or the soldiers who faced them. The apocryphal story does all of these things. It gives names and dates that make the events feel real and specific. It provides numbers that convey the scale of destruction. It creates a narrative that listeners can follow and remember, and in doing so, it preserves knowledge about historical reality that might otherwise be lost when the generation that experienced it dies. The story may not be factually accurate in every detail, but it is historically true in the larger sense. It describes what happened during the Pacific War when American forces discovered that weapons designed to shoot down aircraft were even more devastating when aimed at human beings. The broader question raised by this history is how military effectiveness actually develops. The standard narrative emphasizes technological innovation, new weapons designed by engineers and tested in laboratories. The M45 Quadmount itself was a product of this process. Engineers at Maxon Corporation designed a turret that could mount 4 machine guns with synchronized fire control. White Motor Company developed a chassis that could carry the weight and provide mobility. Army Ordnance approved the design and placed production orders. All of this followed standard military procurement procedures. But the most significant innovation associated with the Quad 50 did not come from engineers or procurement officers. It came from soldiers in the field who recognized that a weapon designed for air defense could be used against ground targets. This realization required no new technology. It required no research and development. It required someone to observe that anti-aircraft weapons sat unused while infantry struggled with targets those weapons could destroy. The innovation was conceptual, not technological, and it emerged from practical necessity rather than systematic planning. This bottom-up innovation is common in warfare, but rarely documented. After-action reports mention using anti-aircraft weapons against ground targets, but do not usually explain how the practice started or who first tried it. Official histories note that it happened, but treat it as an obvious adaptation rather than a significant innovation. The individuals involved are not named because there are too many of them spread across too many units. The result is that military history tends to emphasize technological innovation while underemphasizing tactical innovation. Both types matter. The development of radar and proximity fuses were crucial technological advances, but so was the recognition that anti-aircraft guns could cut down trees and destroy bunkers. The M45 Quadmount story also illustrates the importance of multi-role capability. Systems designed for one purpose that can effectively perform other missions provide operational flexibility. A unit equipped only with specialized anti-aircraft weapons would have been marginally useful once air superiority was established. A unit equipped with weapons that could engage both air and ground targets remained valuable throughout the campaign. This flexibility meant anti-aircraft units continued to contribute to mission success even when their primary mission rarely materialized. Modern military planners recognize this principle. Contemporary weapon systems are increasingly designed for multiple roles from the outset. Fighter aircraft are expected to perform both air-to-air and air-to-ground missions. Armored vehicles are equipped to engage both ground targets and aircraft. Naval vessels carry weapons effective against surface ships, aircraft, and land targets. The M45 was not designed with this flexibility in mind. It demonstrated its value accidentally, but the lesson was learned. Flexibility provides resilience. Systems that can adapt to changing circumstances remain relevant longer than specialized systems that can perform only one mission. The human cost of the Pacific War is reflected in stories like the M45 Quadmount. The weapon existed because aircraft were killing soldiers and needed to be shot down. The tactic of using it against ground targets emerged because soldiers were being killed from positions standard weapons could not effectively engage. Every technical discussion of muzzle velocity and rate of fire exists in the context of people trying to kill each other. The dry language of military documentation, the statistics about aircraft destroyed and targets engaged, represents individual acts of violence and individual human deaths. The American soldiers who operated Quad 50s at Tacloban and throughout the Pacific were mostly young men in their early 20s. Many had been civilians just months or years earlier. They were taught to operate complex weapon systems, sent to the other side of the world, and expected to fight an enemy they had never seen in environments completely foreign to their experience. Most performed their duties competently. Some performed exceptionally. They adapted to circumstances, solved problems with available resources, and contributed to eventual victory. The Japanese soldiers they fought were equally young, equally far from home, equally committed to their mission. The asymmetry of firepower was profound. American forces had access to industrial production that Japan could not match. They had logistical systems that kept them supplied even in remote jungle locations. They had weapons like the M45 that delivered concentrated firepower Japanese forces could not counter. But individual Japanese soldiers were often highly motivated, well-trained, and tactically skilled within the constraints of their situation. The use of Quad 50s against Japanese positions changed the tactical balance in jungle fighting, but did not eliminate Japanese resistance. Japanese forces continued to fight effectively throughout the Philippine campaign using tactics that emphasized terrain, concealment, and defensive preparation. American victory came through sustained pressure across multiple dimensions: firepower, mobility, logistics, air superiority, and naval support. The M45 was one tool among many. After the war, most American veterans returned home and resumed civilian lives. The weapons they had used were either scrapped or stored for potential future use. The M45 went into storage, along with thousands of other weapon systems. When the Korean War began in 1950, these weapons were pulled out of storage, refurbished, and sent back into combat. The same thing happened during Vietnam. A weapon designed in 1943 was still in combat in 1970. This longevity reflects both the quality of the basic design and the continued relevance of the mission. Infantry needed fire support, convoys needed protection, bases needed defense against ground attack. The M45 could provide all of these. The fact that it was obsolete for air defense did not matter as long as it remained effective for ground support. Eventually, changing technology and changing threats made the weapon completely obsolete. By the 1970s, the M45 offered no capabilities that could not be provided more effectively by other systems. It was replaced and disappeared from active service. Most surviving examples are now in museums or private collections, artifacts of a different era of warfare. The legacy of the M45 is not dramatic. It represents competent engineering, practical adaptation, and effective employment. It solved the problems it was designed to solve and proved useful for additional missions its designers had not anticipated. It served for decades across multiple wars and multiple roles. Eventually, it became obsolete and was retired. This is the life cycle of most successful weapon systems. Not revolutionary, but effective. Not glamorous, but reliable. Good enough to matter when it mattered. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.